It had been 3 days since anyone last saw David Mercer. His desk at the newspaper office sat eerily untouched, his phone ringing with no answer. The last time anyone spoke to him, he was on the verge of a groundbreaking story, something big, something dangerous. Then, just like that, he vanished. No messages, no calls, no trace. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air, leaving behind only a half-written article and a nagging sense of dread. Rachel Bennett, his closest friend and fellow reporter, couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. David wasn't one to just walk away, especially not when he was this close to exposing the truth. The more she thought about it, the more the silence around his disappearance felt deliberate, calculated. Someone wanted David out of the picture. But who? And more importantly, why? Rachel sat at David's cluttered desk, her eyes scanning the unfinished article on his computer screen. The words felt heavy, almost like they were hiding something between the lines. David had been digging into a high-profile corruption case involving powerful figures, people who wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who got too close. His last article hinted at a scandal that could ruin careers, maybe even destroy lives. But it wasn't finished. It stopped abruptly, like David had been interrupted, like he had been stopped. Her fingers traced the keys. Her mind racing. Why had David disappeared right when he was so close to revealing the truth? The names, the dates, everything was there, but something was missing, something important. Rachel felt a chill crawl up her spine. Was David's disappearance a coincidence, or was it directly tied to the story he was about to publish? She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he had uncovered was far more dangerous than she had imagined. What if they were watching her too? Rachel sat in David's cramped apartment, the walls lined with notes, newspaper clippings, and highlighted reports. It was as if David had been on the verge of something monumental. Yet now, in his absence, the air in the room felt thick with unanswered questions. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that every piece of paper she touched, every photo she examined, was pulling her into the same dangerous web that had ensnared him. When she started to track down the sources mentioned in David's last articles, things took a disturbing turn. The first few contacts were unreachable, their numbers either disconnected or straight to voicemail. Those who did pick up seemed hesitant to speak. Their tones shifting from confusion to outright fear when David's name was mentioned. One old contact, a retired government clerk, stammered through their conversation before hanging up abruptly. "It's too dangerous now. He got too close, and they don't like that." Rachel's heart raced as she met with Mike, an informant David had mentioned just before he vanished. The bar where they met was dark, and Mike's face was shadowed by the brim of his hat. He looked jumpy, his hands trembling slightly as he sipped his drink. David was onto something, something big, Mike muttered under his breath, his eyes scanning the room nervously. But the more he dug, the more he realized people were lying. He hit a nerve with the wrong people. They don't care who they silence if it means keeping the truth buried. As Mike leaned in closer, his voice dropped to a whisper. "You need to be careful. People disappear for a reason in this town." Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. The lies David had been chasing weren't just words on a page, they were weapons, and someone was using them to cover up something far darker than she had anticipated. The deeper she went, the clearer it became, David hadn't just been chasing shadows. He had found them, and now, they were after her. Rachel couldn't shake the weight of the conversation with Mike. His cryptic warning echoed in her mind, and her gut told her there was something far bigger at play. Armed with David's notes and a growing sense of dread, she decided to dig deeper into the sources he had left behind. As she pieced together fragments of his investigation, the picture became more alarming, a powerful conspiracy that seemed to reach the highest levels of government and business. One name kept appearing in David's notes: Conrad Marshall. A billionaire industrialist with deep political ties, Marshall had kept a clean image in the media. But in David's investigation, there were subtle hints, whispers of under-the-table deals, bribery, and something far more sinister. a network of corruption that spanned several countries. Rachel started her search online, combing through every article she could find on Marshall. Publicly, he was untouchable, a philanthropist who donated millions to charity. But the deeper she went, the more inconsistencies she found. Rachel's investigation led her to a private message exchange between David and an anonymous source known only as X. Their conversations revealed shocking secrets about Marshall's involvement in illegal activities, using shell companies to launder money, bribing officials, and silencing anyone who got too close. David had mentioned meeting X just before he disappeared. What had he uncovered in that final meeting? As Rachel followed David's trail, she found herself constantly looking over her shoulder. Strange cars seemed to follow her through the city, and late-night phone calls were met with dead silence on the other end. It was clear someone was watching her, just as they had watched David. The feeling of being hunted gnawed at her as she drove to the next name on David's list, Carl, a former security advisor who had worked for one of Marshall's companies. David had noted that Carl was key to exposing the full scale of the corruption, and Rachel needed answers. Carl lived on the outskirts of the city, his house secluded and far from any prying eyes. Rachel arrived late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows over the driveway. She knocked on the door, but no one answered. A sinking feeling of dread crept up her spine as she noticed the door slightly ajar. Pushing it open, she stepped inside. The house was eerily quiet, but as she moved further in, the scene she stumbled upon stopped her cold. The living room was in disarray, furniture overturned, papers scattered across the floor. It was as if someone had been searching for something. And then she saw it, Carl's body slumped against the wall, his eyes wide open but lifeless. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The conspiracy had reached him, too. Whoever was behind this, they were eliminating every loose end. Carl had known too much, just like David. And now, Rachel was next on the list. Shaking, she backed away, her mind racing with questions. What had Carl discovered that was worth killing for? And how far would they go to bury the truth? Rachel realized she was now walking the same dangerous path as David. The conspiracy wasn't just a distant threat, it was closing in on her, tightening its grip. She had to keep moving, uncover more, before it was too late. Every clue, every shadow she chased, brought her closer to the truth, but also closer to danger. The deeper she went, the more the lines between friend and enemy blurred. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. With each step forward, Rachel felt like she was slipping further into a web of lies that could cost her everything, just as it had David. The question now wasn't just what she would find at the end of this trail, but whether she would even survive to tell the story. Rachel had uncovered enough to know that this was no ordinary corruption case. The deeper she dug, the clearer it became that a network of powerful people, businessmen, politicians, and even law enforcement, were all connected to David's disappearance. But the more she uncovered, the more dangerous it became. She now understood why David had become a target. He had stumbled upon something much larger than just dirty money. There were shadowy players involved, pulling the strings behind the scenes, and they would stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. Rachel sat in her car, staring at the latest document she had found in Carl's ransacked house. It was a list of names of people who appeared to be untouchable. People who had long controlled the city from the shadows. Conrad Marshall was at the top of the list, but there were others, a high-ranking police commissioner, a senator, and several business magnates. Each one more influential than the next, and each with something to lose if their connections to illegal activities were exposed. The document mentioned the syndicate, a name that sent a chill down Rachel's spine. This was the group David had been chasing. A secret organization operating in the shadows, orchestrating deals and silencing anyone who came too close. Rachel realized now why she had been followed, why Carl had been killed, and why David had vanished. The syndicate had their hands in everything: drug trafficking, money laundering, blackmail, even murder. They operated like ghosts, leaving no trace behind, and anyone who opposed them disappeared without a trace. Rachel knew she was playing with fire, but there was no turning back. She had to expose these people, or she would become another name crossed off their list. She drove to the address listed next to one of the names, a wealthy businessman who owned several construction companies around the city. His name had come up in David's last article draft, but the connection had been vague. No. Now, Rachel understood why. This man was a key player in the syndicate, and she needed to find out what he knew about David. The mansion loomed ahead of her, a sprawling estate surrounded by high walls and security cameras. Rachel parked down the street and approached cautiously. The air felt heavy with tension, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She rang the doorbell, rehearsing her cover story in her mind. When the door opened, a tall, well-dressed man stood in the doorway. His cold eyes scanned her with suspicion, but before she could speak, a voice from inside the house called out, "Let her in." Rachel's heart pounded as she stepped inside. The man led her through a grand hallway, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the silence. They entered a lavish living room where a figure sat by the fireplace, his face hidden in the shadows. As she approached, the man leaned forward, revealing himself to be none other than Conrad Marshall. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected to come face to face with the mastermind so soon. Marshall's gaze was piercing, and he wore a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I've been expecting you," he said calmly, his voice low and calculated. Rachel felt a wave of fear wash over her, but she held her ground. She had come too far to back down now. "You know why I'm here," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Marshall chuckled softly. "Yes, I know all about your little investigation." David was a talented reporter, but he didn't know when to stop. "Just like you." Rachel's blood ran cold. She realized Marshall wasn't just a businessman with a dark secret. He was one of the shadowy players pulling the strings, and he knew more than she had ever imagined. But as terrifying as it was, this was her chance to get answers that might lead her to David, or at least to the truth behind his disappearance. "What happened to David?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marshall leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "David learned too much. Just like you're about to. But knowledge can be dangerous, Rachel. It's a weapon, and not everyone survives wielding it." The words hung in the air, a chilling warning of what lay ahead. Rachel realized she was in far deeper than she had anticipated. She wasn't just chasing a story anymore, she was caught in a game of survival against people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. And the more she uncovered, the more she became a threat. The shadowy players in this game were watching her every move, and now she was certain they wouldn't let her walk away unscathed. The only question left was, how far would they go to silence her, just as they had silenced David? Rachel had always trusted Peter, her closest friend at the news agency, and the one person she thought she could count on during this dangerous investigation. They had worked together for years, uncovering stories that rocked the city and brought down powerful figures. But now, as she stood outside a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town, clutching a folder of damning evidence, a horrible realization was sinking in. Peter had betrayed her. The clues had been there all along, but she had been too focused on finding David to notice them. Peter had been unusually quiet ever since David's disappearance, brushing off her concerns and urging her to drop the story. At first, she thought he was just worried about her safety. After all, they had both seen how dangerous these kinds of investigations could get. But now, things didn't add up. Peter had access to confidential information about David's last article, information only someone on the inside could have leaked. And suddenly, everything started to fall into place, the strange delays in their investigation, the missed connections, and the anonymous threats she had received. Rachel's hands shook as she opened the folder, revealing photos, emails, and documents that tied Peter to the syndicate. He wasn't just helping them cover up the corruption, he was working with them. He had sold out, betraying everything they had stood for as journalists, all for money and power. Rachel's heart raced as she stared at the evidence in disbelief. Peter, the one person she thought she could trust, had been lying to her this whole time. The betrayal felt like a punch to the gut. She had risked everything to get this far, and now, her closest ally had turned into her biggest enemy. It made sense why Peter had been so eager for her to back off the investigation, why he always seemed to be a step ahead. He had been feeding her just enough information to keep her going, while secretly working to protect the syndicate's interests. Rachel realized with a sinking feeling that Peter had likely played a role in David's disappearance. He had known all along what would happen to David when he got too close to the truth. As Rachel gathered her thoughts, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Peter: "We need to talk. Meet me at the usual spot." The usual spot. It was the same bar where they used to meet after long days at work, where they had celebrated their biggest journalistic victories. But now, Rachel knew this meeting wasn't about old times or camaraderie. It was about control. Peter had realized that Rachel was onto him. And he was trying to stop her before she exposed him. Rachel hesitated, knowing she had to play this carefully. If Peter had betrayed her, there was no telling what he would do to protect himself and the syndicate. She was walking into a trap, but she had no choice. She needed to confront him, to confirm what she already knew. The evidence she held in her hands was enough to bring him down, but she had to be smart about it. One wrong move, and she could end up like David, missing, or worse. That night, Rachel arrived at the bar, her heart pounding in her chest. She spotted Peter sitting in a dark corner, his face partially hidden by the shadows. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it felt like old times, but Rachel knew better now. She slid into the booth across from him, her mind racing with the weight of the betrayal. Peter leaned in, his voice low and calm. "You've been digging too deep, Rachel. You don't know what you're getting into." Rachel's jaw tightened. "I think I know exactly what I'm getting into. You've been working with the syndicate, haven't you?" Peter didn't flinch. Instead, he sighed, as if he had been expecting this moment. "It's more complicated than you think," he replied quietly. "I didn't have a choice. You don't understand what these people are capable of." Rachel's anger flared. "You had a choice, Peter. You sold us out, you sold David out. How could you do this?" Peter's face darkened. "You're in over your head, Rachel. If you don't back off, you'll end up just like David. They'll come for you next." Rachel's blood ran cold. She had suspected Peter's involvement, but hearing him confirm it sent a chill down her spine. He wasn't just involved, he was fully complicit, and now he was threatening her. But she couldn't let fear stop her. "Not now, I'm not backing off," Rachel said, her voice steady. "I have everything I need to expose you and the syndicate. It's over." For the first time, Peter's calm facade cracked. His eyes flashed with a mixture of anger and desperation. "If you go public with this, you'll be signing your own death warrant. They'll destroy you, Rachel." But Rachel wasn't backing down. The betrayal had only strengthened her resolve. Peter might have been part of the conspiracy, but he wasn't the mastermind. The shadowy players were still out there, pulling the strings, and Rachel knew that the only way to stop them was to expose the whole truth. Even if it meant risking her life, she stood up, the folder clutched tightly in her hand. "It's too late, Peter. The truth is coming out, whether you like it or not." As she walked away, Rachel knew she had crossed a line. There was no turning back now. The betrayal had cut deep, but it had also revealed the final pieces of the puzzle. The syndicate was closing in, and Rachel was running out of time. But she wasn't giving up. Not until she found out what really happened to David, and not until justice was served. Rachel was no longer just searching for David, she was now being hunted herself. Every step she took was shadowed by an unseen presence, every phone call felt like it was being tapped. And every glance over her shoulder revealed nothing but suspicion lurking in the air. The deeper she dug, the more dangerous her world became. The syndicate was closing in, but the truth was just within her grasp, almost tangible, yet slipping through her fingers like sand. She spent her days running from one source to another, piecing together fragments of information that seemed too elusive to form a complete picture. David's last few leads had taken her into the darkest corners of the city, where secrets were sold and loyalty was a commodity. Everyone she met had something to hide, and yet, none of them dared to speak openly. It was as if an invisible force kept their lips sealed. And Rachel could feel it pressing down on her too. The pressure was suffocating, but she couldn't stop now. In the dim light of her small apartment, Rachel stared at the corkboard she had created, cluttered with photos, articles, and cryptic notes. David's face was pinned in the center, a constant reminder of why she couldn't give up. Around him were the faces of those connected to the syndicate, men in suits, government officials, businessmen, all with too much power to be held accountable. But what was the connection? What had David found that made him such a threat? A name kept coming up, one that hadn't meant much at first but was now circling her investigation like a dark cloud: Marcus Steele. He was a wealthy businessman with his hands in everything from real estate to politics, a man known for being untouchable. But rumors about his involvement in under-the-table deals and criminal enterprises whispered through every dark alley she explored. And David had been chasing him too. Rachel's heart raced as she reviewed David's final article draft, now in her possession, thanks to a risky source she could barely trust. It was incomplete, but there were enough hints to point to Marcus Steele. Could Steele be the one behind David's disappearance? It was a possibility that gnawed at Rachel's mind. Steele had the means, the motive, and the ruthlessness to silence anyone who got too close to the truth. But proving it would be nearly impossible. One night, Rachel received an anonymous message, a location, nothing more. It was a place far outside the city, where abandoned factories stood like the skeletons of forgotten dreams. The shadows seemed thicker there, heavier, as if they carried the weight of secrets long buried. Rachel knew it was dangerous to follow the lead, but what choice did she have? She was running out of time, and the walls were closing in. The drive to the location felt endless. Every minute stretched her nerves thin as she imagined what awaited her. Was it a trap? Would she find answers? Or would this be her final chase? The silence of the night was deafening, broken only by the occasional hum of her car's engine. Her heart pounded as she pulled up to the desolate spot, the wind howling through the hollow buildings. The shadows seemed alive here, twisting and shifting, keeping her on edge. As she stepped out of the car, Rachel felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. She scanned the area, her instincts on high alert, when a figure emerged from the darkness. At first, she thought it might be Steele, or worse, someone sent to finish what had been started. But as the figure stepped into the dim moonlight, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't Steele. It was someone she never expected to see again. Rachel's pulse quickened as the familiar face came into view, bringing with it a flood of memories, fear, and hope all at once. The man standing before her was someone she thought had vanished forever, someone who might hold the key to everything. David. The shadows were no longer just metaphorical, they were real, and Rachel was chasing them down to uncover the truth, no matter how dangerous or twisted it might be. The secrets were within reach. But the danger had never been greater. Rachel's heart raced as she stared at David, standing in the shadows of the abandoned factory. He was alive, but he wasn't the same. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, haunted by the things he had seen, the secrets he had uncovered. For a moment, time seemed to freeze as the weight of their journey pressed down on her. She had been chasing ghosts, and now, here he was, flesh and blood, but broken. David, she whispered, barely able to believe it. He stepped forward, his voice low and rough. You shouldn't have come, Rachel. She felt a rush of anger, confusion, and relief all at once. What are you talking about? I've been looking for you. What happened to you? Where have you been? David shook his head, his expression darkening. It's not that simple. You don't understand, it's all much bigger than we thought. They're everywhere. The syndicate. They have eyes everywhere, ears in every corner. I was getting too close, and they made me disappear before I could expose them. But they let me live. For now, Rachel's mind whirled as she tried to process his words. We can still expose them, David. We have to. You have everything you need, your article, the evidence. We can take them down. David's eyes flashed with fear. You don't get it, Rachel. They've already won. They control everything, politics, business, the media. They'll silence anyone who gets too close. I'm only alive because they want me to be. And if you keep digging, they'll come for you too. Rachel took a deep breath, determination burning in her chest. I don't care. I didn't come this far just to walk away. We expose them, no matter the cost. We're journalists. It's what we do. But before David could respond, a noise echoed through the empty factory, a low rumble that sent a chill down Rachel's spine. They weren't alone. From the shadows, men in suits emerged, their faces cold and expressionless. At the center of them was Marcus Steele, the man at the heart of it all. His presence was like a dark cloud, his eyes gleaming with the confidence of someone who knew he couldn't be touched. Well, Steele said with a slow, menacing grin. Looks like the two of you just can't stay away from trouble. Rachel's pulse pounded in her ears, but she stood her ground. We know what you've done. We have proof. Steele laughed, a deep, chilling sound that echoed in the vast emptiness. Proof? You think anyone cares about proof? I own the courts, the politicians, the police. Even if you could get this out there, it wouldn't matter. I've already won. Rachel's heart sank, but she refused to back down. You may think you've won, but the truth always comes out. People like you can't hide forever. Steele's smile faded, replaced by a cold, deadly glare. Perhaps. But neither can you. He raised his hand, and in an instant, his men stepped forward, surrounding them. Rachel felt a wave of panic rise in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had come too far to give up now. David stepped forward, his voice firm. Let her go, Steele. She has nothing to do with this. Steele's gaze shifted to David, and for a moment, something unreadable flickered in his eyes. You were always the idealist, David. That's why you were such a problem. But now, you're just a loose end. With a flick of his hand, Steele signaled his men, and everything exploded into chaos. Rachel and David ducked behind a crumbling pillar as gunshots rang out, the deafening sound echoing through the factory. Steele's men closed in, but Rachel refused to give up. They had come too far to let it end here. Grabbing a metal pipe from the ground, she fought back, adrenaline coursing through her veins. David, too, sprang into action, his survival instincts kicking in. Together, they fought their way through the chaos, dodging bullets and taking down Steele's men one by one. The air was thick with tension, every second feeling like a lifetime as the showdown reached its climax. Finally, it was just Steele left, standing in the shadows, his cold eyes still gleaming with malice. He pulled out a gun, aiming it directly at Rachel. You really should have walked away, he hissed. Rachel stared him down, unflinching. I don't walk away from the truth. Just as Steele was about to pull the trigger, David lunged forward, knocking the gun from his hand. The two men grappled, their struggle a desperate fight for survival. Rachel joined in, and together, they managed to disarm Steele, pinning him to the ground. For the first time, Steele's calm facade cracked. He looked up at them with a mixture of fear and fury. You think this changes anything? You think you've won? Rachel's breath came in ragged gasps, but she met his gaze with unwavering resolve. No. But this is only the beginning. As the police sirens grew louder in the distance, Rachel knew their fight wasn't over. The syndicate might still hold power, but they had dealt a significant blow tonight. Steele would face justice, and with him, the secrets of the syndicate would start to unravel. The truth had been buried in shadows for too long, but now, it was finally coming to light. the factory, once a battleground of chaos and confrontation, lay eerily silent as the dust settled. Rachel stood outside, staring at the remnants of the fight, her heart still racing. The police had arrived just in time, but it felt surreal to think that the danger was finally over. David stood beside her, his face a mixture of exhaustion and relief. "I can't believe it's really over," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel nodded, but uncertainty gnawed at her. "Is it really over? We exposed Steele, but what about the rest of the syndicate? They're still out there." David rubbed his temples, a weariness settling over him. "You're right. This was just one battle in a much larger war." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the debris, Rachel felt the weight of what they had accomplished, and what lay ahead. She had hoped that capturing Steele would bring closure, but the fight against corruption was far from finished. The media would be buzzing with their story, and while it was a victory, she knew it was only the beginning of a long, complicated journey. Days turned into weeks as the news broke. Headlines blared about the fall of Marcus Steele and the shadowy syndicate that had controlled the city for years. David and Rachel were hailed as heroes, their story captivating the public's imagination. They gave interviews, shared their experiences, and revealed the truth that had been hidden in darkness for so long, but as the dust settled from their victory, the lingering fear began to creep back in. Rachel found herself looking over her shoulder, feeling eyes on her even in the most mundane moments. The aftermath was not just about the accolades and recognition, it was also about the unsettling realization that the syndicate still operated in the shadows, and they would not take their defeat lightly. One evening, while reviewing their notes and gathering evidence for the upcoming court case against Steele, Rachel received an unexpected call. The number was unfamiliar, but something compelled her to answer. "Rachel," a low voice said, sending chills down her spine. "You've stirred the pot, and now you're in over your head." Her pulse quickened as she recognized the threat. "Who is this? What do you want? You've made powerful enemies, and they won't stop until you're silenced. Consider this a warning." Before she could respond, the line went dead, leaving her staring at her phone in shock. "David," she called, her voice shaky. He rushed into the room, concern etched on his face. "What's wrong?" "Someone just called me. They said we've made enemies and that we're in danger." David's expression turned serious. "We knew this was a possibility. We have to be careful. We can't let them intimidate us. We have to keep pushing forward." Rachel nodded, but fear gripped her heart. The weight of their actions felt heavier now. They had brought light to the darkness, but it seemed that darkness was fighting back. As the days passed, Rachel began to notice small, unsettling changes in her life. An unfamiliar car parked outside her apartment. Strange figures lingered in the corners of her vision. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, like a storm brewing just out of sight. David, ever the optimist, reassured her. "We can't let fear control us. We have to keep going. We'll make sure the story gets out there, and we'll be safe." But Rachel wasn't so sure. She felt the anxiety gnawing at her, threatening to unravel her hard-won composure. Even as she worked to compile their findings, the fear of retaliation hung over her like a dark cloud. One afternoon, as she sifted through old documents, she stumbled upon a file containing more information about the syndicate. It was a collection of names, dates, and connections that could unravel the entire operation. Her heart raced as she realized the potential impact of what she had found. "David!" she shouted, excitement mingled with anxiety. "You need to see this." He joined her, peering over her shoulder at the evidence spread out before them. "This could be huge," he said, his voice tinged with a mixture of disbelief and hope. Rachel's mind raced with possibilities. "If we can connect these dots, it might lead us to the other members of the syndicate. We could expose the entire organization." As they worked late into the night, piecing together the connections, Rachel's determination began to overshadow her fear. This was what journalism was about, unearthing the truth, exposing corruption, and fighting for justice. But with each discovery, the stakes grew higher. They could feel the danger closing in, the shadows lurking just beyond their reach. The moment of confrontation had passed, but the aftermath was a battle of its own, a fight for their safety in a relentless pursuit of justice. In the weeks that followed, Rachel and David prepared for the impending court case against Steele, gathering evidence and organizing their findings. They knew that their testimony would be crucial in taking down the syndicate for good. However, the threats only intensified. One night, as Rachel returned home from a late meeting, she noticed that the car parked outside her apartment had followed her. Her heart raced as she fumbled for her keys, her hands trembling. She hurried inside, locking the door behind her and peering through the window. The car sat there, engine running, its headlights piercing the darkness. "What do we do?" David asked, his expression grave. Rachel's pulse raced. "We can't let them intimidate us. We need to continue our work and expose them." But as they settled in for the night, the uncertainty hung in the air, a constant reminder of the battle they had chosen. The fight was far from over, and as they prepared to face whatever came next, Rachel realized that they had already crossed a line from which there was no return. Together, they would chase the shadows, no matter the cost. The journey ahead would be fraught with danger, but with each step they took, they moved closer to the truth, and closer to a final showdown with the darkness that threatened to consume them. As Rachel and David stood on the brink of their greatest victory, the world outside their windows buzzed with the echoes of a story that had captivated the city. The trial against Marcus Steele was set to begin, promising to unveil the deep-rooted corruption that had plagued their community for years. Yet, amid the anticipation and hope, a nagging uncertainty lingered in the air, like the chill of a shadow refusing to dissipate. The courtroom was filled with reporters, spectators, and members of the community eager to hear the truth laid bare. Rachel felt a mix of exhilaration and dread as she prepared to testify. She knew the weight of her words could topple the syndicate, but they also put a target on her back. As the trial commenced, each revelation felt like a step into a minefield. Steele's defense team was relentless, twisting the narrative to cast doubt on Rachel and David's findings. For every piece of evidence they presented, it seemed there was an equally compelling counterargument, sowing confusion among the jury. Rachel could feel the pressure mounting, and with it, the shadows of fear creeping closer. In the evenings, she found herself revisiting her fears, the unsettling calls and the dark figures that had followed her. Despite the public bravado, the haunting reality of their situation pressed heavily on her shoulders. Was the fight worth the price? Would exposing the truth protect them, or put them deeper into danger? Weeks turned into a blur of testimonies and cross-examinations. Each time Rachel took the stand, her heart raced with the knowledge that the very act of speaking could have dire consequences. But with each testimony, she also felt a growing sense of purpose, an unwavering determination to see this through to the end. The community needed to know the truth, and she couldn't back down now. As the trial reached its climax, a pivotal moment arrived. Rachel and David uncovered a piece of evidence that tied Steele directly to higher-ups in the government, a connection that could turn the tide in their favor. The adrenaline surged through her as she prepared to reveal this explosive information. But an unsettling thought flashed through her mind: what if this discovery brought more danger than she could handle? On the day she was set to reveal the evidence, Rachel received another anonymous call. "You're playing a dangerous game, Rachel. Watch your back." The voice dripped with menace, sending chills down her spine. She glanced at David, who was oblivious to her growing anxiety, focused on their strategy for the day. As she walked into the courtroom, the weight of the world pressed against her chest. She caught sight of Steele, who smirked at her from across the room, a calculated confidence in his demeanor. The trial felt like a stage, and Rachel knew she was a player in a game that had higher stakes than she had ever anticipated. When the moment came, Rachel stepped forward, her voice steady but her heart racing. As she presented the evidence, she could feel the tension in the room thickening. The truth hung in the balance, and she was the one holding the scales. Would the jury see the light, or would the shadows continue to loom? In that moment, a strange sense of calm washed over her. She realized that they had already ignited a spark of change, that their pursuit of truth had begun to shift the landscape of corruption, even if the shadows still lingered. As the verdict drew near, Rachel and David prepared for the fallout. They knew that the shadows of the syndicate would not vanish easily. Regardless of the outcome, the fight was far from over, and they would have to remain vigilant. In the end, victory was not just about winning the trial, it was about challenging the darkness that lay beneath the surface of their world. The battle had awakened a sense of responsibility within them, a realization that the shadows would always be there, lurking in the corners of society. With their hearts set on continuing the fight, Rachel and David left the courtroom, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next. They were no longer just reporters chasing shadows, they were advocates for truth, armed with the knowledge that the pursuit of justice was a journey, not a destination. Though the shadows still lingered, they would not let them dictate their lives. Together, they would confront whatever darkness lay ahead, committed to illuminating the path for others who dared to seek the truth. And as they stepped into the uncertain future, the shadows were no longer something to fear, they became a reminder of the light they were determined to shine.
Please like this video and subscribe the channel and click on bell icon.